Welcome everyone to Citizen Climate Lobby's Canada's Education Call on May 29th, 2018. Tonight we have with us Dr. David Maenz. He's going to be giving us an overview of the shell sky scenario and meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. But before he does that, I would like to give you a little bit of brief background about David. So David holds a Ph.D. from the University of Saskatchewan, and he's a co-founder of MCN BioProducts in 2001. This was really cool. He's an inventor or co-inventor of 7 patents, and also the author of 33 scientific papers and 2 chapters in books. I have got to know David over the past few months because more recently he wrote a book called The Price of Carbon, where he distilled the science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and the International Energy Agency, what many of us at CCL call, as well as David calls, the most important issue of our time. Mark Reynolds at Citizens Climate Lobby, our executive director, has called it, I'll just paraphrase it, The Price of Carbon is a timely book full of important information. I encourage you all to read it, but tonight we will be reviewing with, or for many of you, maybe looking at the shell sky scenario. Thanks for being with us tonight, David. Would like for everybody to mute your lines, and if you don't, I will. You have a question, put them in the chat line. David's going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll start with the questions. Go ahead, David.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Kathy, and thank you everyone for tuning in and for this opportunity to describe the shell sky scenario. Presentations on climate change tend to cover future scenarios of disruption of weather patterns leading to climate change damage, and there's perhaps less of an emphasis in these presentations on outcomes based on achieving the actual goals of the Paris Agreement. And I'd like to kind of start off by just saying it's not all doom and gloom. Much of the technology required to transition to a decarbonized world is established or well advanced, and there is considerable opportunity for further development. The shell sky scenario that I will describe is one of many potential models for transition to a zero emissions world over the next 50 years. If one of these scenarios were to unfold, much of the damage and extreme costs of unmitigated climate change would be avoided. What is different, however, about the sky scenario is that it was developed and released by one of the largest traditional energy companies in the world. So before going into details on Shell's scenario, I'm going to go over some background materials on emission reduction scenarios to set this up. So what are climate change scenarios that fall under the Paris Agreement? These can basically be described as models of transitions of economic practices to limit the accumulation of greenhouse gases during the current century as required to achieve the core objective of the Paris Agreement. I think most of you are aware of this, but in December of 2015, the world got together in Paris, France, and declared that we're going to hold future temperature increases to less than well below 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial temperatures. So in building these models or scenarios of future emissions to limit surface temperature elevations to reach these targets, this modeling exercise begins with establishing a budget of carbon that can be safely accumulate in the environment. Recently, the Mercator Research Institute has put an online carbon budget and a carbon clock that anyone can look at. It sort of has a bit of a visual that it's sort of a doomsday clock, but in certain respects, this is actually true. So under the 2 degrees scenario, that is holding future surface temperatures to less than 2 degrees, the IPCC has established that there's a remaining budget of about 705 billion tons of carbon dioxide. And this is what's shown in this carbon budget and clock by the Mercator Institute. At current rates of emissions, this budget will be exhausted in 18 years by 2036. If future surface temperatures are to be held to 1.5 degrees, the scenario is quite dire. The remaining budget is about 12 billion tons of CO2, and get ready for it, this budget would be exhausted by the end of this summer. Okay, so what scenarios or models of future emissions do then is they develop models of progressive decarbonization of practices such that emissions go down as cost effectively as possible while avoiding an overaccumulation of greenhouse gases that would exceed the carbon budget. So there is some potential for overshooting the budget. What I mean by that is that emissions would be greater than the budget, but this would be compensated in latter decades by actually transitioning to net atmospheric carbon dioxide withdrawal. And I'll describe how this can happen in just a few moments. So what we have here are 3 examples of scenarios for future emissions. The green line is based on current policies that are in effect across the globe. And under current scenarios, we would see emissions continue to increase, peak somewhere past the year 2030, and then decline slightly. If this were to transpire, the budget of emissions would be grossly overspent, and we would impose a future of about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius in surface warming. The extreme damage and costs of climate change would be then imposed upon future generations. Alternatively, if emissions were to peak in 2020 and then progressively decline, arriving at 0 emissions at around 2070, the budget of emissions would be safely released under 2 degrees Celsius of future surface warming. If, however, we want to limit future surface warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to arrive at 0 emissions just a little past mid-century, and then transition to negative emissions over the course of the second half of the century as required to draw down the excess in emissions that was released in the early decades of the current century. So let's take a look at where emissions come from. And this is an overview of global emissions. About 25% of global emissions are classified as indirect, in that the greenhouse gases are released from the production of electricity and a small amount of heat that is used mostly by industry and buildings. Industry accounts for about 21% of direct emissions, and this is through combustion of fossil fuels and release of CO2. Transportation is responsible for 14% of global emissions. This term stands for agriculture, forestry, and other land use. So these are viewed by the IPCC as integrated sectors. They account for about 24% of global emissions. Within these integrated sectors, we see a fair amount of emissions of methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture, along with some CO2, and a substantial amount of CO2 emissions from forestry, and this is as a result of net global deforestation and release of CO2 from destruction of global forests in excess of replanting forests. Other energy refers primarily to methane and carbon dioxide release from the oil and gas industry, and buildings finally account for 6.4% of direct emissions. So this is a model for decarbonization over the course of the current century, published by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2014. And what the IPCC has done is divide emissions into carbon dioxide, shown across economic sectors, and non-CO2 emissions, and this is again primarily methane and nitrous oxide. So we see CO2 emissions in 2014, 2030, mid-century, and then end of century. And in this model, CO2 emissions progressively decline across economic sectors, and this is driven by a combination of improved energy efficiencies, fuel transition from fossil fuels to electricity or non-emitting alternatives. And there's a significant role for carbon capture and storage, which I'll describe in a moment. So after all practical abatements are in place, all of these models show residual emissions of methane and nitrous oxide. This is primarily coming from agriculture to feed a growing population around the world. These emissions must be offset by carbon dioxide withdrawal. And in all models, we see a massive program of global reforestation and afforestation. So what was once a source of CO2 emissions, by reestablishing forests and planting new forests, we end up with carbon dioxide withdrawal from the global forestry. However, there are serious concerns about the land area available to provide the biomass to provide what is required for carbon dioxide withdrawal. As a result, most models, including this one, incorporate industrial processes for net carbon dioxide withdrawal. And this is, and I'll describe this in the next graph in a little more detail, this is based on a global fleet of bioenergy plants that are outfitted with carbon capture and storage. So in total, industrial carbon dioxide withdrawal plus carbon dioxide from forest biomass offsets residual emissions that are primarily coming from agriculture. So what is carbon capture and storage? Carbon capture and storage can be applied to combustion of fossil fuels for the production of electricity. And in Canada, specifically in South Saskatchewan, is one of the first large commercial scale facilities that captures carbon from production of electricity using coal. 90% of the CO2 at Boundary Dam is captured, and assuming that this CO2 is permanently stored in deep saline aquifers, you get a dramatic reduction in emissions from the production of electricity from fossil fuel power plants. CCS can also be applied to industry that use fossil fuels to reduce their emissions, and CCS can be used for industries where CO2 is released as a part of the process. And this is a chemical release of CO2 that happens, for instance, in cement manufacture. However, the real possibility or the real potential of CCS to curtail future emissions is applying this to biomass. So as plants grow, they're constantly photosynthesizing and sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So plants are constantly pulling CO2 from the atmosphere. Biomass plants would use potentially sustainably harvested forests, or more likely, energy crops that are farmed specifically to be used for biomass production of electricity. So the biomass then would be combusted to produce electricity. The CO2 would then be captured, injected into deep saline aquifers, and the net result is that atmospheric CO2 is withdrawn into the biomass, captured, and isolated from the biosphere. So with this background, I'll describe the specific features of the Shell Sky scenario to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Royal Dutch Shell, and this is the Shell, one of the largest corporations in the world, was the 6th largest company in the world based on revenues in 2016. This is a massive multinational, vertically integrated oil and gas company, and it's active at all phases in the use of fossil fuels. It's one of the 6 oil and gas super majors, and just a few months ago, Shell released the Sky scenario, and this is a model for the transformation of economic sectors and practices as required to limit future surface warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius. It is then a Paris Agreement type of model. So here is just a brief overview of how under Sky emissions are envisioned. The peak emissions are a little delayed, they're indicating this would happen about 2025, and then it undergoes a sharp decline, and at around the year 2070, residual emissions are balanced by sinks, and this would include forestry or industrial withdrawal of carbon dioxide, and then going forward to the end of the century, carbon dioxide withdrawal becomes extremely important to offset, again, the excess emissions in the earlier decades. So this shows Shell's version of total energy use. Currently, energy use globally comes from fossil fuels, 22% from natural gas, 32% from oil, 27% from coal. Biomass, and a lot of people don't realize this is quite important. Most of this biomass is used in developed countries for traditional heating and cooking purposes. Nuclear power is about 5%. Others is mostly hydro, and currently wind and solar account for just 1% of global energy use. Going forward over the next 50 years, in Sky, a massive increase in total energy use is foreseen. And this is as a result of increasing population and economic development in sub-Saharan African countries and Southeast Asian countries. So there'll be more energy required. The big change, however, is in the mix of energy that goes forward. Sky envisions a massive increase in use of solar. Solar would be the dominant form of energy in 50 years. And this would be supplemented by wind, nuclear, and hydro. Biomass would also be very important. This biomass would be used with carbon capture and storage. Sky envisions a limited role for fossil fuels going forward over the next 50 years, with coal, oil, and natural gas accounting for about 22% of total energy demand, and carbon capture and storage would be very important to reduce emissions from these traditional energy sources. So if we look specifically at electricity, and I mentioned electrification of transportation and other industrial practices, and this is going to result in a large increase in global production of electricity, and simultaneous to this is a huge shift in the mix of sources of energy to produce electricity. Coal fades quickly and is almost gone by mid-century. Natural gas declines and it vanishes from the mixture of energy sources for the production of electricity in the second half of the current century. Solar in Sky is viewed as the most important energy source for production of electricity, followed by wind, nuclear, hydro, and biomass. And most of this biomass will be facilities that have carbon capture and storage applied to biomass energy, electricity production. So let's take a look at the individual economic sectors. In the last 5 years, we've seen tremendous advances in the transportation sector, such that in Sky, Shell anticipates that electric vehicles will reach cost parity within 7 years, and by 2035, which isn't that long, that isn't that far away, 100% of new car sales would be electric in advanced economies, and other countries would be close behind. Oh, and just as an aside, I was looking at some statistics from Norway today, and Norway just last month surpassed 50% of new car sales are electric vehicles. They lead the world in this. So looking at improved energy efficiencies and electrification, high efficiency standards would be applied to building codes, appliances, and electronics. And again, the idea here is to minimize the energy requirements, the electricity requirements for these applications. Complete electrification of buildings is foreseen. So using fossil fuels to heat homes would no longer exist. Everything would be done by electricity. And of course, the electricity that's used is completely greenhouse gas free. Energy efficiencies in industry would approach mechanical and thermodynamic efficiency limits. So basically, there is no longer energy inefficiencies in industrial practices. And finally, there'll be a massive shift in thermal energy to electricity. The biggest opportunity here is production of steel and using electric arc furnaces rather than thermal energy to fuel that process. So here's a overview of this should actually say the thermal energy balance system envisioned in Sky. As I mentioned, Shell still does see a limited role for fossil fuel extraction and use. Core to this balance is 10,000 large carbon capture and storage facilities around the world. A portion of this would be applied to industry to take fossil fuel emissions and store this underground. However, most of these CCS facilities would be bioenergy facilities to result in a net industrial withdrawal of carbon dioxide. So overall, when you look at this balance of flows of carbons, we see net negative emissions of about 6.4 billion tons per year, with industrial processes drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. Almost all scenarios, including Sky, envision an important role for natural systems, mostly forest biomass, to contribute to atmospheric withdrawal of carbon dioxide. So the way this would work is a global implementation of land use programs. And ideally, this starts very soon. And we start to dramatically reduce deforestation in places like Indonesia. And just as an aside, 2.6% of global emissions are coming from deforestation in Indonesia as we speak. And there's no logical reason for this to continue. Programs can be put in place to dramatically reduce deforestation and problems with forest degradation and land use. Eventually, this would transition to reforest these deforested areas and to afforest or establish forest in new areas, along with land use restoration. There are a number of institutes that have looked at the maximum potential and very good work at MIT and also the Woods Hole Research Center have established that there is potentially up to 10 billion tons per year of potential to withdraw atmospheric CO2 through programs of afforestation and reforestation. This would require an area the size of Brazil to have new forest cover. This will not be easy, however, in that achieving this massive use of land for forested area would require a redistribution away from the land-intensive use of agriculture for ruminant meat production. And therefore, if you're going to get the maximum potential here, we would have to have societal transformation away from consumption of meat coming from beef, goats, and sheep. These societal barriers will probably limit this maximum potential, and it'll be less than that. If, however, the maximum potential of forest biomass to withdraw atmospheric carbon dioxide was added to the potential for industrial processes to pull CO2 from the air, this could be up to 16 billion tons annually. And if this was put in place, this massive CO2 withdrawal capacity would allow us to limit future surface warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So under Sky or in Sky and other scenarios that would achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement, this is not going to happen spontaneously. This requires visionary leadership from government. And this is the first statement that Shell put out. It's going to require a complex combination of mutually reinforcing drivers being rapidly accelerated by society, markets, and government. But the most significant emissions targeted action taken by governments around the world is the adoption of effective implicit or explicit carbon pricing mechanisms. So here is how Shell sees the growth or the increase in carbon pricing with time. And this would be the global average pricing. And I'm going to read to you directly from the report here, just so you get a sense of the significance of this. In Sky, government-led carbon pricing emerges as a suite of taxes, levies, and market mechanisms. Surprisingly quickly, a common understanding is reached between governments as to the appropriate level of the cost of emissions. By 2030, in Sky, government-led carbon pricing is firmly established throughout advanced economies, and China, with Russia and India forming the second wave of entrance to carbon markets. Global implementation of carbon pricing is complete by the late 2030s, with all systems achieving a credible limit to deter emissions. In Sky, carbon pricing has two other significant consequences. First, it speeds up the adoption of CCS for large emitters, while driving the deployment of net negative technologies such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Second, carbon pricing encourages emission reductions across the whole economy, especially through improving energy efficiencies, thus generating significant shifts in consumer and producer behavior. So this graphic summarizes timelines and milestones in Sky. There's a lot going on here, and what I'm going to do is just hit some highlights. So the entire process begins in 2015 with the Paris Agreement. Liquid fuel demand for passenger vehicles begins to decline in 2020. In Norway, as an example, they're already seeing significant decrease in demand for fossil fuels in the transportation sector with this very advanced state of electrification of vehicles. Very quickly, governments reach a common understanding of carbon pricing, and this will happen over the course of the next decade. The first few countries reach net zero emissions at around 2040. Solar passes oil as the largest source of energy used across the planet. And net deforestation stops and transitions to programs where the biomass of plants around the world provides carbon dioxide withdrawal capacity. All regions meet net zero emissions by 2070, and going forward into the latter decades, we're looking at under the Shell Sky scenario, carbon capture and storage reaching about 12 billion tons per year. And this net negative emissions completes the transformation to a sustainable decarbonized economies around the world. So obviously, in the Sky scenario, if this was to transpire, it's going to have profound effects on the demand for oil, and this is going to happen quickly. This graph shows the International Energy Agency projections based on current policies, in blue here, and under what they call the 450 scenario, which means that end of century atmospheric CO2 is held below 450 parts per million, and surface temperature warming is below 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial times. If we make that transition, the demand for oil dramatically drops. And this is about a 25% reduction relative to current policies. Here's where things get fascinating. It's going to cost about $11 trillion to develop this supply under the current scenario. If, however, we transition practices as required to limit future surface warming, this cost of producing this oil drops to $6.8 trillion. This red line shows a disjointed scenario whereby all of a sudden, one day the world wakes up, and this doesn't happen until 2030 or so, and introduces drastic policies to curtail emissions. What happens then is that you end up with tremendous losses globally from the energy sector due to stranded assets that were put in place based on this indicator of demand, when in actual fact, this was what happened. This would be catastrophic to energy industries around the world. So the question that no doubt in a lot of people's minds is, why would Shell, as a massive multinational corporations with assets firmly entrenched in conventional oil and gas industry, have produced a long-term vision for the transition and the decarbonization of practices to a zero emissions world? My take on this is Shell does not want to deliberately fry the planet. It sees its future as transitioning to a broader energy company under a decarbonized scenario. Shell is not the only major industrial player to come out in support of carbon pricing and changes of practices to lower emissions options. If you look at this list here of major corporations, no doubt there are some who would consider these companies to be intransient promoters of the status quo for a business as usual continuation of traditional energy use. What these companies are the founding corporate members of the Climate Leadership Council. CLC is a policy institute that actively lobbies Congress in the US, and they're promoting an immediate implementation of a $40 per ton carbon fee that would be applied to fossil fuels. So what industry wants, and indeed needs, for long-term business planning is clarity of purpose as to the future direction of carbon policies. And you know, the conversation on climate policies has to advance well beyond right-left political ideologies. The reality of climate change has to be the basis, such that we're discussing what are the most cost-effective ways to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. And in all cases, this requires effective carbon pricing mechanisms. I'm going to scoot back here and just bear with me for a moment. I'll be there in just a second. Oops. Yeah, okay. I usually don't do personal anecdotes, but I'm going to here. Kathy encouraged me to tell this little story. And actually, I don't even think it's a personal anecdote in that I think it applies to most people. 4 years ago, I became a grandfather. And one of the motivations in getting involved in writing the book and trying to promote awareness of the whole issue of climate change is the fact that my grandson is probably going to be alive in 2080. Based on just statistics. I'm long gone. But what's going to happen over his lifetime is going to be decided right now, over the next 10 to 15 years. If we don't do anything, it's too late. We've already spent that carbon budget, and the hardships and extreme cost of climate change will be imposed on my grandson's generation, even though he had nothing to do with the decision making that happened over this course of time. And I think where it's beyond a personal anecdote is I think everyone has young people that are dear to them. And it's this intergenerational responsibility, I think, is core to the whole discussion of should we or should we not take action on this issue. And with that, will conclude my presentation.
Well, thank you, David. I can't believe that 37 minutes have gone by. That was impeccable storytelling. I love science. I love graphs. I followed this storyline that you just, this incredible story that you took us on. I think without naming names, and this is you recently spoke to a politician, but we won't say who it is, just say it's conservative. Did you introduce some of this data to the politician? Do you want to speak a little bit about that? Do you feel comfortable doing that at this point?
Yeah, I'll speak about it in very generic fashion. This was a leader of a political party in Saskatchewan who definitely was on the right of center. And I walked him through, sort of as a bit of a background. Yes, he did understand and believe in the reality of anthropogenic or man-made climate change, and he did see a need for us to take action. And at this point, it was, yeah, but we have a vision that does not involve carbon pricing. And I sort of indicated that, well, if you're not going to use carbon pricing, you're not using the most cost-effective way to deal with this problem. And I sort of talked him through the fact that in the absence of carbon pricing, it's going to require a complex series of policies that will be extremely costly and ultimately far less effective than using market mechanisms. And that resonated, and especially when I indicated that Shell had just come forward with a scenario that was where carbon pricing is deeply embedded as an economic driver of transition, and that I think was effective in communicating this whole thing. There's an article that just came out yesterday in Nature. And it described the cost of inaction, and this has been done many times, but it basically ended up with saying that how can you not take action? Look at the amount of money you're going to save relative to the extreme costs of building dikes, attempting to control sea level rise. A loss of agricultural lands, et cetera, et cetera. It's a no-brainer in terms of return on investment, and the investment is actually not that big. So I hope that answered your question, Kathy.
Oh, that completely answered my question, and just got it over in the chat box over here. Wow, very inspiring from Sandy in Calgary. I think we have a volunteer in Nelson who has a couple questions. I think that I wouldn't mind. I would love to see a discussion between you and Judy for a couple minutes. I hope that's okay with Judy, that she turns off her mic and asks David a couple questions, please.
Hi, David. Thanks for this. It's really, really interesting. I had two questions for you. The first one was, do you know if Shell has adopted this scenario into their official strategic plan as they go forward?
No. The way they have put this forward is we're not going to do this unless the economic drivers come into place across the world. In the absence of carbon pricing and mechanisms coming in place around the world, they would go bankrupt doing this on their own. It's got to be a level playing field for all of these energy companies. This will be adopted in synchronization with a global effort.
Okay, thank you. The other question I had was just more of a comment, just wondering if you looked at Tony Seba's work at Stanford on clean disruption, because it seems to really support what you're talking about, where he talks about all these major tipping points coming pretty quickly, especially on solar and electric vehicles.
Yeah, what's happening, and it's really interesting. When I wrote the book, it took a long time to write, about 2.5 years, and the transportation sector, and I was using data at the time when I was writing, all indications were that it's going to take up till mid-century for that transition to electric vehicles. And in the last 2.5 years, the cost of batteries has gone down to the point where I'm very close to one of these tipping points, where it just makes more sense to make electric vehicles rather than internal combustion vehicles. And that's why Shell sees such an important role for solar, because they envision cost of batteries and storage going down, and then solar then becomes the most cost-effective method. So yes, these tipping points are happening quickly.
Thank you.
Your neighbor in Regina, David's in Saskatchewan, says, totally fantastic, David. The most straightforward and understandable explanation of the compelling need to take climate change seriously. I'm wondering if there are any other questions out there, or if we can start wrapping this up and maybe have a little bit more of an informal discussion, not recorded. You got 10 seconds. I'm going to stop the recording, and then we can be a little bit more informal afterwards. Okay, I'm a geek. This was like book club for climate science geek. I loved everything I just heard for the last 40 minutes. I am feeling so inspired. I see a path forward. I have immense gratitude for your vision, your imagination, your capacity to help start seeing the future in a different way and guiding others to see it as well. Thank you so much, David.
Hopefully to kick off some, I love this informal discussion. When my talks tend to go on and on into this section here. And one thing I want to throw out here, and I didn't mention this in the course of the presentation, side benefits. This is a staggering number to me. The World Health Organization has calculated that there are over 7 million early deaths per year globally that are a result of air pollution. And about half of this is what they call internal air pollution within buildings. And most of this is in developing countries, traditional use of wood and other biomass, and the pollution inside of the home. And the other half is outdoor air pollution. Most of this is coming from coal. This is, this is a staggering number. It's greater than the number of lives lost during the Holocaust. And it's hardly discussed at all. A transition to decarbonized practices out of necessity will require economic development in developing countries and modern cooking practices, etc., and the elimination of coal combustion. The savings to the health industry, people are talking about this more and more. And it's a tremendous side benefit that has real economic as well as humanitarian advantages.
I'm so glad you found us. I'm going to turn off the recording, but you're an amazing source for us. Thank you so much, David. We'll stay on the line. I'm just going to stop the recording now. Thank you, everyone.